What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So we got a Steam Deck video here. Cyberpunk has got its patch 2.13, which brings AMD FSR 3 and in-game frame generation. This is a pretty great update, especially for these handheld devices. Now again, patch 2.13, this is for the PC version of Cyberpunk, and most importantly it brings Fidelity FX Super Resolution 3 with frame generation in game. They also added XeSS 1.3, which I'll probably take a look at in a future video because I do like that upscaling, but we're going to stick with FSR 3 here. Quality for our upscaling, and then we have frame generation there. You can see here what my settings are, which is mostly a combination of medium and low, mostly leaning into medium. These certainly aren't recommended settings, and you can squeeze more performance out of this game on a deck by lowering some more, but this gives me a baseline to just kind of stick with for the video and look at performance. They do still have 2.1 in here if you want to mess with that, or you don't want to mess with frame gen, but FSR 3 here and in-game frame gen. Now, taking a quick look at this, we've got quality when it comes to FSR 3 here, bouncing around 57 to 63 FPS, and on bounce, it's similar. We get a little boost here and there, but because we are a little bit CPU bound and stuff here with this, and we aren't boosting the GPU clock yet, you don't see a big difference. Going to performance, we get a little bit more. Going to native AA here with FSR 3, we're going to come down into the 40s. It's really not playable when you get into other areas of the game, but figured I'd show it there really quickly and then back over to quality. We're going to talk more about the frame gen thing though, because to get this to really work properly, we're really going to need to use manual GPU clock. Now in a lot of games we just go with 1600 here, and it does give us the most FPS most of the time, but you see what it does to the CPU usage and the speed of the CPU, and this can really hurt us in CPU intensive areas like battle, fights, more NPCs and things like that. But you'll see as we bring this down a little bit, we can kind of tweak this and find a happy spot for this to work out, and kind of depending on where you're at in this game or maybe even other games, it can help you out. Down to 1300 here. Actually, if we hit 1200, this is a real sweet spot where you'll see the frame timeline really smooth out here, and we've got a nice balance of the power here between the CPU and the GPU. But that's right here where we're sitting still. It wouldn't necessarily be that way everywhere in the game, but I have found here in Cyberpunk that finding something good between the 1200 and 1600 while I'm playing tends to work the best. So hopefully that helps kind of guide you in the right direction of what you need to do there. So you'll see manual GPU clock on and off in this video, and a variation of 1200, 1400, and 1600 as we get into it. And it should give you a general idea of what the performance is looking like for this update, bringing FSR 3 and in-game frame generation to the Steam Deck. So some quick compare here. You've got the auto GPU, the manual set to 1200, manual set to 1600 with all the same settings here for that medium, low, and everything we looked at in the beginning of the video, all with frame gen on. And you'll see that the highest frame rate of course is from the 1600 here, but we're not hitting the CPU as heavy in the benchmark as we do in real world gameplay, but I still want to use this just to show it. But we do get the cleanest frame times and the smoothest experience out of that 1200 that I was showing you earlier. So again, for what you prefer out of what performance you want to get, you're going to have to pick something between that 12 and 1600. And you can see here 64, 63, and 69 on the frame rate. But again, the frame rate only tells part of the story. You want to make sure you're getting a smooth experience as well. Now, if we take and turn frame gen off all the way to the left, leave it on the other two on the right with 1200 and 1600, you can see kind of what we're getting as far as difference in performance using frame gen and not using frame gen with all the same settings and still FSR 3 quality. Actually, this game still runs really well without frame generation on, and is pretty smooth even out in real world gameplay, except for some certain areas, especially in Dogtown and Phantom Liberty DLC, which we all know can get kind of rough. But yeah, we've got 47, 63, and 69 here when comparing those three. Now, if we take a look at just the no frame gen here in that similar spot as we did earlier, quality on our FSR, we're about 43 FPS here. If we go to balance, we'll come up about 3 FPS to 46. And if we want to bump up again to performance, which really has come a long way in FSR, this used to be just about eye bleeding to look at in Cyberpunk, but with FSR 3, this actually looks pretty good. We get another 3 FPS. If we go to native, it will look nice, but it gets unplayable in most areas and brings us down into the 20s, even just sitting still. And do a side-by-side here, you can see with frame gen off and frame gen on, walking through here what we've got for performance. And of course, the cleanest frame times overall are with no frame gen on the Steam Steam Deck. It does feel a bit smoother and better for input latency typically, but I will say this is one of the better implementations of in-game frame generation I've seen so far on the Steam Deck that seems to work pretty well, especially if you kind of work a little bit with that manual GPU clock and try to get things balanced out, especially kind of depending on what area of the game you're in and are you in Phantom Liberty DLC, Dogtown, and that type of thing. Then you can see here again we've got frame gen off versus on here, and the auto GPU in 1600 here, so you can kind of see how this game's performing with the FSR 3 with and without frame gen and with those different GPU clocks there. Of course, moving around in Cyberpunk, if you're driving, is when performance can get a little rough. And outside of Phantom Liberty DLC, it tends to stay pretty good with and without frame gen with FSR 3. And typically that's been the case for a while since some of the updates and optimizations to the game. And overall, I think frame gen works good in most of these areas, and I don't really have any problem with it. But I also like the game without frame gen and FSR 3 on. I think it works pretty well. I don't notice any real input latency on the in-game frame gen that would affect my gameplay much, especially if I was playing it that way enough to get used to it, but it always is a little bit snappier without in-game frame gen, though AMD has made a lot of headway when it comes to how well it works these days, especially in games like Wukong. I'm still just surprised at how good in-game frame gen is in that game. When you get into Dogtown, though, this is where performance gets pretty crazy, especially on the Steam Deck. I'm actually getting some pretty good performance over on the Ally X and the Legion Go right now with this update, but we are kind of hardware bound, CPU bound, and you know, it gets a little clunky in certain areas of the game when you get into the DLC. It certainly does typically stay playable and those frame rates will bounce around. It's probably better to try to lock something like 30 in these areas, but just want to show the FPS here, and in battle it can get clunky as well, though again it does basically stay playable, but those frame times and stuff can get pretty rough here, especially with frame gen on. We just don't have a high base frame rate for that frame generation to build off of. And if we switch to turning frame gen off and keeping all the settings the same here, you'll see it's a little bit smoother of an experience, but the frame rate of course is lower. But we're taking a little bit of pressure off the system, just kind of running it without the frame gen. So it's kind of interesting there. It actually kind of feels better here at this lower frame rate than it did in this area with the frame gen on, though both were kind of playable. Now without frame gen, we still dip here in this same battle area, and you're going to be playing in the 20s and 30s either way, or 40s and 50s with frame gen and stutters and that kind of thing. We just hit the limitations, and you're going to really need to balance out where you're putting the power between the GPU and the CPU when you're trying to get certain areas to run as good as you want to, or for your preferred performance. But overall, this update is pretty great, especially if you're trying to play this game on the Steam Deck. You can also certainly lower some settings. I left some at medium that you could actually boost this performance a little bit more. You can up your FSR a little bit when you do that as well, and certainly play around with that. But don't hesitate to mess around with the manual GPU clock anytime you need to try to balance things out if you're using frame gen here. If you're not, the game's working well with FSR 3. Alright guys, thanks a lot for coming and check out the video as always. Hopefully it gave you an idea of what this performance is looking like with Cyberpunk now on the Steam Deck with these updates both with and without frame gen. Alright, again, thanks a lot for coming and check it out. As always, I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.